which continues to inspect Iranian nuclear facilities, has repeatedly and consistently stated that no nuclear material has been diverted from the civilian program, unquote. You might want to heave a sigh of relief, but don't, not just yet. Let's first consider the very peculiar manner in which Leon Panetta framed his denial of an Iranian nuclear weapons program. The Iranians, he said, need to be pressured, quote, to join the international family of nations and act in a responsible way. I think the pressure of the sanctions, I think the pressure of diplomatic pressures from everywhere, Europe, United States, elsewhere, is working to put pressure on them, stuck on that word, to make them understand that they can't continue to do what they're doing. Are they trying to develop a nuclear weapon? No. But we know that they're trying to develop a nuclear capability, and that's what concerns us. And our red line to Iran is do not develop a nuclear weapon. That's a red line for us. Is there anyone else to whom this sounds peculiar? I mean, not just rhetorically redundant, but mildly insane. Quote, and this is my paraphrase, if you like, these people need to be subjected to the pressure of pressures so that they don't continue doing what they're doing or actually not doing. A much younger generation than mine has a code for responding to things like this, WTF, whatever that might mean. I'll pretend not to know. It might be added in parentheses, since I began by talking about media deceptions, that what one might take to be Panetta's key words, quote, are they trying to develop a nuclear weapon? No, unquote, were edited out of his statement the following evening by PBS anchor Margaret Warner, who on PBS NewsHour reduced it to just this soundbite, quote, but we know they're trying to develop a nuclear capability, and that's what concerns us, unquote. Very clever, eh? Now, Defense Secretary Panetta seems not to be the only person in Washington afflicted with the cognitive bifurcation of wanting to stop people doing what they're not doing. On January 12th, Karen DeYoung and Scott Wilson of the Washington Post quoted an unnamed U.S. intelligence official as saying that, this is the journalist's paraphrase, I guess, quote, the intelligence community stands by its controversial 2007 conclusion that Iranian leaders have not decided whether to build a nuclear bomb, unquote. That seems sane enough, though controversial is presumably the journalist's acknowledgement of the rage of Vice President Dick Cheney and his neocon subordinates at being denied by the 2007 National Intelligence Estimate of their pretext for attacking Iran. But listen to what DeYoung and Wilson then quote as the intelligence officials' own words. Quote, our belief is that Iranian leaders are reserving judgment on whether to continue with key steps they haven't taken regarding nuclear weapons, he said. Whether to continue with steps they haven't taken. Okay. Now, that's what I wanted to say about the issue of media deceptions. How am I doing for time? 41. Oh, there's a clock there. I didn't see it. Okay. Which is running an hour fast. It's not yet 10 o'clock, thank goodness. I just want to say some very brief speculative things, or not so speculative, about the economic and political instabilities that make war tempting, both to the United States and to Israel. And I think I can put this very briefly. I'm not referring here to specific texts, though I'll be happy to take questions. The most obvious factor is the economic decline of the United States, the hollowing out of all but its military industrial capacities, growing discontent within the United States. The Occupy Wall Street protests, which spread across the nation, are one sign of that. And a fear of great power competition with the rise of China and the at least partial resurgence of Russia. Russia in a primarily military capacity, China, of course, as the major coming economic superpower, and also, in recent years, the second largest spender in the world on military hardware. Now, I think we can take as a general principle that empires in decline are tempted to military action that they might otherwise recognize as rash. There's also a large question of energy geopolitics, which I'll speak of in the final section of what I want to say. Now, with regard to Israel, it's a different situation, and it's a situation, I think, of what one could call the aporia, a Greek word for blind alley or dead end or blocked movement forward, of the Zionist project. One sign of this is the current balance of inflow and outflow of people into and from Israel. Emigration has for some years apparently exceeded immigration. But the principal issue, I think, is a very naked choice that has been spoken of with surprising openness by a significant number of major Israeli politicians, including Olmert, the previous prime minister, and many others. And it's a choice between attempts to fulfill the Zionist project of Eretz Israel, which, as Olmert and many others recognize, leads into a loss of what Israel has in democracy, leads to a non-democratic future, to a future of apartheid, and a future of appalling conflicts and conflagrations, which I think could be summed up in what is to me, I think, a quite obvious fact, that the fulfillment of that project means a repetition and the completion of the Nakba. It means ethnic cleansing. It means the kind of thing that some of the politicians in Netanyahu's government, most notoriously Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman, have openly spoken of. Lieberman, back when he was transportation minister, was all for taking the Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails and drowning them in the Sea of Galilee. He said, I'm transportation minister, I'll provide the buses. There's this horrendous kind of chutzpah willingness to speak of things that one would think arouse immediate echoes of the Shoah. Or another Israeli government minister who threatened the Palestinians with an even greater Shoah, actually used the word. So there's been discursively a kind of step beyond the boundaries of what would previously have been taken to be forbidden. That's what was done to us 60 and more years ago. That's what Nazis do. The idea that people are now people in positions of government, as opposed to complete fringe fanatics, are willing to deploy that sort of rhetoric is profoundly disquieting. And it does suggest that a portion of elite opinion within Israel has already made that choice. Yes, this is what the project involves, and they're willing to go forward. Now, of course, the other alternative is that of an equitable partitioning of Palestine. Well, there are two alternatives, I suppose. One would be a one-state solution, which is actually, and ironically, exactly what the Ayatollah Khamenei is recommending. Right? Get all these people together. Jews, Muslims, Christians, they all live in Palestine. They're all Palestinians as far as he's concerned. Let them vote freely and without... Now, that is anathema, of course, to those who insist on an ethnic state. And here's part of the sort of aporetic dead-end problem. That is the notion of ethnic states. I mean, it resurfaced in the Yugoslav Civil War in a horrible way. But that is an inheritance from a loathsome 19th century discourse of racist and ethnic nationalism. So there's the possibility of, if you like, a one-state solution, or the other possibility, which now appears to be effectively extinct in the opinion of many commentators in Israel and elsewhere, the two-state solution. How can you achieve such a solution when you have well over 500,000 people settled in apartheid colonies within the occupied territories? How do you get them out? Shy of a civil war. Now, that I think is one of the central issues that is impelling this current situation, that is impelling an extremist politician like Netanyahu to intervene with daring openness in the American presidential electoral process on the side of people who are as fanatical as he is. People like Gingrich, who, as you may be aware, has recently declared that there's no such thing as Palestinian people. Going back to the kind of fraudulent, long exploded notions of propaganda, a people without a land for a land without a people. How did these Palestinians get it? Well, we made things so green and flourishing that they just flocked in from other places, and now somehow we have to get rid of these recent immigrants. Behind that, of course, is the I think fascinating and truly appalling irony that it appears, when one steps beyond mythography into historiography, that a very large proportion of the Palestinian people, i.e. non-Jewish Palestinian people, share the ancestry or are descended from the ancient Jewish people who inhabited that country at the time of the Romans. And by an equal irony, that a proportion at least of the population that came into what is now Israel, beginning with the rise of Zionism in the late 19th century, and of course impelled by the consequences of the Shoah, that some of those people are descended from other peoples, the Khazars, the Berbers, and so on, who have no ancestral connection. Now that doesn't alter the depth of a connection, but it is, one would hope, one reason for recognizing kinship, recognizing brotherhood and sisterhood. Whether that can happen, I don't know, but there are obviously Israeli historians who are working to spread an understanding of that. Now, I want to say something briefly about likely plans of attack and defense. And the first thing to say is that what we're looking at is, I think, a long-term project within the American state apparatus of regime change. Changing the direction of any form of sort of state decision-making that's already implanted in reports and the thinking of many people and so on, is a little bit like changing the direction of an ocean liner. You can put the helm hard over, 25 degrees over, and the engine's full astern, and the bloody thing just keeps on going. I had a little bit of experience in smaller ships in my youth. Changing the direction of a destroyer takes a surprising amount of time. You put the helm over hard, and it keeps going for the length of a couple of football fields before anything happens. So here we have a long implanted set of state policies that go back at least until that period of the captivity of the embassy staff in Tehran, the American embassy staff, the American horror with the fall of the Shah of Iran, who had been one of their major kind of geopolitical subordinates, keeping the Middle East in order. Now, I say that this project has a kind of inexorability because in 2010, President Obama raised what he thought was a bar that was higher than the Iranians would even dream of jumping over. He said, look, if you make an agreement with Brazil and with, Lord, who else was it? Sorry, can someone help me here? Turkey, thank you. With Turkey and Brazil, so that they are involved in the process of the nuclear fuel cycle. In other words, so that we can have an assurance that you're not diverting this stuff into weapons. And to his, I think, shock and astonishment, the Iranians got together with the Turks and they got together with the Brazilians and they came up with a solution. All three states agreed. Whereupon the Americans simply raised the bar higher. I think that was one clear sign, and with indignant propaganda about how these Iranians are just impossible to deal with. They keep saying yes. Now, I think that was one very clear sign that when Obama or when European politicians talk about, why can't we get these people to the table? Well, the Iranians agreed to a confidence-building interval of 2 years in which, in conversation with the three, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, they would try and sort of, with the Europeans working as intermediaries, they would try and work out a solution. And what they found is the Europeans were simply serving as conduits for their, in effect, instructions from Washington. And the instructions were very clearly, don't let anything be solved. And after 2 years, the Iranians said, sorry, we're restarting. And that was represented publicly as, another horrifying example of aggressiveness and intransigence. Now, in other words, there is a long-term plan of regime change, and there's also a long-term plan of active involvement with potential agents of regime change, including that bizarre organization, the Mujahedin-e-Khalq, and also other organizations, notably the Jundala. Now, both of these are terrorist organizations. They plant bombs. The Mujahedin-e-Khalq were responsible quite some time ago for a highly successful attack that killed, I think, over 70 members of the Iranian parliament. And by the way, there's been recent revelations in the news that the operations of the Mujahedin-e-Khalq were used by the Israelis for their attacks on Iranian scientists. Now that is quite clearly terrorism. Although it's not considered such in the American press. That's interesting, right? That ludicrous, obviously, almost childishly confected case of a used car dealer who got in touch with Mexican gangs to supposedly assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States. That was described as terrorism. But when American intelligence officials tell NBC, as they did either today or yesterday, that yes, the Israelis used the Mujahideen, the MEK, to carry out and trained them to carry out these attacks, in other words, confirming what the Iranian government has said about the documents they possess and the confessions they've obtained from one person who was captured. At the same time, there have been recent reports, again within the last week or two, that the CIA is very annoyed with the Israelis for impersonating CIA officers and recruiting Jundala people, again for much the same purposes. Now, at the same time as we get these reports, we also have President Obama making bizarre statements using metaphors like the United States remaining in lockstep with Israel. And I think we have to understand that kind of statement in relation to what I said earlier about the American presidential election campaign. He's clearly responding to what he and his advisors feel to be the kind of exigencies of the campaign, without a whole lot of concern for the fact that that gives his primary alien enemy, if you like, Netanyahu, a completely free hand to drag the United States into a war that could be militarily disastrous. Militarily disastrous because what the Iranians have been developing is something that American defense analysts call anti-access and area denial strategies. That's A2 and AD. They love these little, contractions. A2 and AD. That's what them Iranians are doing, and it's something that the Chinese have done. And what we're facing in sort of military naval terms is in some ways analogous to what happened to the battleship in World War II. The battleship was discovered to be obsolete. When the British sent two of their best ships into the areas being attacked by Japan in 1941, and they were almost instantly destroyed by Japanese air power. That was a clear sign. The destruction of the Bismarck was another one. The destruction of the Japanese battleship Yamato, again by air power. Well, the current obsolescence, I think, may have to do with giant floating airfields, aircraft carriers. They're effectively obsolete in relation to the missiles developed by Russian scientists since the 1980s. One of them goes by the NATO code name of Sunburn. A variant of it was co-developed between Russia and India. It's known as the BrahMos. The Indian Navy possesses it. It's a missile. If you think of what happened in the Falkland Islands, do you remember the exocets that destroyed some British ships? Although flown, delivered by antiquated jet aircraft, flown by extremely courageous Argentinian pilots, they managed to do very large damage. Those were sub-speed of sound. The Sunburn missiles travel at something in excess of 2.5 times the speed of sound. They're capable of maneuvering. They can be fired in salvos. The consensus among American naval experts seems to be that they have no answer to these things, meaning that the American Navy cannot repeat the kind of saber rattling it carried out in the late 1990s in the Taiwan Strait, for example, because the Chinese have got these missiles both on ships that the Russians sold them, two Sovremeny-class destroyers equipped with Sunburns, and in shore batteries. So anti-ship missiles with a range of something like approaching 200 miles, or perhaps even more in the later variants. The Iranians, I don't believe, possess those. What they have are earlier, in effect, obsolete ship-to-ship, shore-to-ship missiles, which nonetheless, in the confined spaces of the Persian Gulf, could be deadly to American naval units. The Iranians have super quiet diesel-powered submarines, which are hard to detect. They have swarm tactics, which were deployed by an American general in a large war game played by the United States in 2002, in which, to everyone's surprise, the enemy won. The guy who was playing the Iranians, they were given some cockeyed name so that we wouldn't think this was aggressive, used swarm tactics involving small ship attacks and so on and so on. And they started the game again and said, okay, we're going to exclude those tactics because the good guys have to win. In other words, I don't want to make rash predictions because the preponderance of American air power, of American missile power, Israeli air power, Israeli missile power, and the naval power that could be exerted by America and its allies, who might include Canada, is overwhelming. One key question is, could Iran succeed in closing off the Straits of Hormuz? For about 100 kilometers, there are passages that are, in many cases, well under 30 kilometers in width, with narrow shipping lanes within that distance. Therefore, vulnerable to missile, small craft, and other kinds of of attack. Could Iran close the Straits of Hormuz? Yes. For how long? That's a very difficult question, which I wouldn't venture to answer. What that would mean is closing off the pipeline, in effect, seagoing pipeline, through which in 2008, 40%, more recently down to about 33% of the world's shipborne oil passed. 17% of all oil sent across borders in the world passes through that strait. So the economic impact would be gigantic. And what President Obama faces quite clearly is another kind of aporia. On the one hand, he's got political opponents who, with the sole exception of Ron Paul, are trying to paint him as the weakling who will allow these genocidal people to have their bomb and threaten Israel, and threaten the rest of the world, of course. Or he's facing the possibility of a military action that could create gigantic and possibly long-term economic consequences. And that are, of course, uncontrollable in the consequences. Because an attack on Iran would almost inescapably involve counter attacks both against American forces and against Israeli forces and against Gulf states which allowed their territory to be used for aerial attacks on Iran. Hezbollah would be drawn in, almost certainly, which would mean Israel involved in another war against Lebanon. There are various scenarios that have been sketched out by people, including former CIA agent Philip Giraldi, whom I quoted before, which could involve things like the reigniting of tensions between India and Pakistan, could involve the drawing in of other states as well. And this is a very interesting question. I'm moving now to the last issue of geopolitics. Because part of what the United States is engaged in is a long-term geopolitical project that was enunciated in the late 1990s by, for example, the Silk Road strategy approved by Congress, which was a strategy of, in effect, moving into Central Asia, the old Silk Road, playing the great game, in effect. The project for a new American century strategy, announced in 2000 by people who subsequently became the mainstay of the George W. Bush government. Or since it was never elected or re-elected, I would say the George W. Bush regime. Now, what do these strategies involve? Well, they involve, among other things, a recognition that a very high proportion of the major energy reserves of the globe are contained in the Middle East and in Western Asia, Caspian Basin, Iran, and so on. Iran, although it had a first peak of oil production as early as 1974, 6.1 billion barrels, it rose, I think, to decline during the revolution period, declined through the 70s. It's now back to about half what it was at its first peak. That, of course, is one reason the Iranians have said they want civil nuclear power. Because their oil has either peaked or will peak, definitively, and it will then be in decline. And as it becomes increasingly precious, do you want to burn it as gasoline or as fuel to supply electrical plants, or can you do something else? Now, whether post-Fukushima that's a good idea or not is another question, but that at least is the thinking. Now, two aspects of the geopolitics include other major nuclear powers. First, Russia, which after the catastrophic decline it experienced following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the decay of Russia's economic and military power, has undergone, at least militarily, a kind of resurgence. The United States has been behaving in a very provocative manner, building what are clearly, by any military analyst's understanding, first strike capability radar facilities in Poland right next to Russia. And trying to say, oh, these are to protect us from those Iranians. I mean, the Russians are not, they weren't born yesterday. So it may be in response to that the Russians have been a little more willing to allow some of their missile technology to be disseminated elsewhere. The Sunburn missiles to China, which is a major geopolitical blow to the United States, to India. The S-300 anti-aircraft missiles to Iran. Iran now has them. Whether they're in quantity or deployed yet, I don't know. But those missiles, which are not quite the S-400 is the current sort of generation used by the Russians. The S-300, though, is a highly capable missile air defense system, which would make air war against Iran, if they were fully deployed, a much tougher proposition than it currently is. And finally, of course, I think most crucially, there's the question of the petrodollar economy. Now, in February 2006, I published an article on what then appeared to be the oncoming war with Iran, because there was a real crescendo of drumbeats, and it appeared to be connected to the fact that Iran had announced that it was going to form a Tehran oil bourse that would trade oil and natural gas not in US dollars, but in euros or other currencies. And that is a mortal threat to the American geopolitical economic system. The US dollar as fiat currency is basically what supports the military might of the US empire. Were other countries, there already are in fact, there's a lot of bilateral trading that's now going on in renminbi and in other currencies between countries. Iran is now trading oil in basically any currency other than dollars. Saddam Hussein in 2000 announced that he was going to trade his oil in euros rather than in US dollars. And by some analysts thinking that was a part of what prompted the American decision no longer simply to choke the Iranians with murderous sanctions, but to invade. The final part of the geopolitical issue is, of course, the fact that a hold on those Middle Eastern and Western Asian oil supplies would give the United States very significant leverage in relation to China. So there are the possibilities, and one can see this in the Security Council votes, right? For example, over Syria, a horrendous regime, which is also, in addition to being horrendous, being subjected, I believe, not just to the revolt of a disgusted and sick of all that crap population, but also to the work of the regime change operations of the United States and other countries. Russia and China are refusing to go along with the rest of the Security Council on this. And I think the reasons are quite clearly a measure of their geopolitical interests. Now I'm going to conclude, I'm sorry I've gone on longer than I should have. I'm going to conclude simply with a reference to a curious fact that one of the inscriptions in the entrance to the United Nations building in New York, as many of you know, is a quotation from the Farsi classic Gulistan. And it's there because it's an expression of common humanity. I'm not going to quote it, it's a very simple and resonant statement of human solidarity, of human brotherhood, and of what we have in common. And I think it's that kind of ideal that we need to hold in mind when we look at the totality of this situation. When we look first at the media deceptions, when we look at what I take to be the contemptible position taken by our own government on these issues, and when we look at the very serious and I think pressing dangers that are facing not merely the people of Tehran and the rest of Iran, whom we saw so interestingly engaged with by Rage Omar in the film clip that Michael edited for us, but that risk a conflagration that goes further in all directions. Many people in Israel could see their lives destroyed by such a conflagration. Many people in other countries throughout the Middle East. Should nuclear weapons be used, and I mean here not just the nuclear weaponry of depleted uranium that has been already used in 4 or 5 wars, but nuclear bombs, then a major threshold will have been crossed. And when politicians say everything is on the table, it's the crossing of that threshold that they're envisaging. So I think we need to do all that we can in exercising that ancient Greek duty of fearless speech, of parrhesia. We call it, more often than not, speaking truth to power. But we need it. We need lots of it. And thank you for being here. Sorry, it went on so long.
It's wonderful. We have to be out of here by 10. I'd like to have a few questions, and I'm hoping what we can do is maybe Michael can pick several people to just ask fast questions, and he can answer with one answer that kind of covers it. We should maybe 10 more minutes. Is that okay with you, Michael?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. If there are people that have some questions, they can maybe ask them briefly, and we'll answer them. By the way, while I'm just up here,